Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordan Schmidt, and I'm a political analytics graduate student here at Columbia, as you could have probably assumed. Upon graduating, I hope to use my skills to promote and increase political efficacy and interest among females, women. That being said, I'm very excited to introduce Kelly Rader. In addition to being a political analytics lecturer and teaching our course on surveying and polling methodology, she is also the Director of Research and Analytics at States United Democracy Center. Today, she will be moderating our panel discussion on Is Polling Dead? Facing the Challenges in Measuring the Electorate. Thank you.
To start off, let me introduce our illustrious panel. We'll start with the man to my left, Robert Shapiro. Bob is the Wallace S. Sayre Professor of Government in the Department of Political Science in the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia. He specializes in the historical study of public opinion. He is also one of the two Bobs who taught me everything I know about public opinion. And next to him is Michael Bocian. So Mike is a founding partner at GBAO, one of the leading Democratic polling firms in the country. In 2022, he was named Pollster of the Year for his work on some of the biggest Democratic races, including Senators Raphael Warnock, John Fetterman, and Governor Tony Evers. Mike has conducted research in all 50 states on a variety of issues: healthcare, climate change, education, immigration, foreign policy, criminal justice reform, reproductive healthcare, and others. And at the end, joining us is Christine Matthews. Chris is the president of Bellwether Research, a center-right polling firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. She has conducted political polling for candidates at all levels and is proud to work with candidates who support democracy, civility, and responsible governance. She will be conducting research for Larry Hogan's 2024 Senate campaign and for numerous super PACs active in presidential and congressional races on a variety of issues for advocacy and policy clients. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here today. Before we address our provocative, animating question, is polling dead? Let's give our audience a sense of the landscape of polling methods that are currently in use. So we are well past the days of all in-person interviews, well past the days of calling people on landlines. Bob, in an email to me earlier this week, you described the landscape as the Wild West. Do you want to give people a sense of what you mean by that?
Well, it's the Wild West in the sense that there are all kinds of different polling and sampling methods have been used. And it's the Wild West in terms of finding out exactly what polling methods and sampling methods are used. In the old days, it was easy. We could talk about polling being done originally through face-to-face surveys, national samples. Today, the only existing in-person surveys that are done using probability sampling methods are at least in terms of polling attitudes, is the National Opinion Research Center General Social Survey and the American National Election Studies. They still have an in-person national probability sampling component to it. So in the old days, it was in-person interviewing, the early days of Gallup, Lou Harris, and all of that. There were problems in using those methods. Then there was the big transition to telephone surveys using RDD, and this is now, the lingo is RDD, not regression discontinuity, but it's random.
The other RDD.
The real RDD, random digit dialing, which worked very well for a while during the early days of polling. The polling organizations could call telephone numbers and get response rates that are on the order of 50% or better and so forth. The in-person surveys that the GSS and the ANES continue to do had response rates of 80% or more. Now they've gone down closer to 60 and so forth. But then with the advent of cell phones, the answering machines, the ability to screen phone calls, the response rates from the RDD surveys have gone down to single digits. There's a long history there. I just won't bore you. But the big question is RDD polling dead? And the answer is it's getting pretty close. The other kind of polling that's dead is exit polling, having to do with the way elections are conducted. But the Wild West is the following. That is, fast forwarding to the president, a lot of polls are done using the internet. And the kinds of sampling designs that are used there are as follows. One is for elections. I think the gold standard for political consultants and others now is or will be getting to be using voter files for that kind of thing. And the voter files now include telephone numbers. I just learned recently, this was news to me, that there are ways of finding out the billing addresses of cell phone numbers, which is really important in terms of if you want to make contact by mail, or if you want to find out where people are living, because the cell phone area codes don't correspond geographically to where people live anymore. And the big advent dealing with the response rate issue, I mean, voter files are good because you have a list. And if you can sample from a list, that saves a whole lot of work. And now the advances now with regard to a list are the recruitment by pollsters of two kinds of panels. Now panels here, the word panels is usually referred to a pool of people who you interview repeated times, either as part of one study, but nowadays as part of potentially many studies. There are survey companies out there that recruit panels either through non-probability methods, getting volunteers any way they can to be on a panel, to then be given incentives and payments to do surveys. And then the other method, which is the closer to a gold standard method, is to recruit not probability sample panels using address-based sampling, recruiting them from RDD surveys. But then, I mean, to do it right, the organizations that have been doing this on a big scale, which include Gallup, Pew, Ipsos, RAND, and others out there, they use address-based sampling to contact people many times and to get them to agree to be in a sample. So that's a probability sampling method. And then they go back to these people for repeated polls. And now, to find out what methods are being used, I'm going to stop here because I could take too much time. When I go check the latest polls, like Real Clear Politics for the presidential polls, I'll click on polls in the state of Michigan. And then what I'll do is, I look at the numbers, that's interesting. I click on the polling organization. I want to find out what methodology it uses. And the mystery there is they're all talk about samples of registered voters. Okay, well, unless you tell me how the registered voters were obtained, did you use an RDD sample and ask people whether they're registered, or were you working for a voter file where you know their registration and their history of voting? Sometimes that information isn't readily available. So the Wild West, it has to do with the different methods that are being used. I mean, there's RDD, and also the polling methods involve people responding on phone, internet, now through text, and even resorting to mail surveys and paper surveys, or giving people QR codes to go to websites. But finding out what methods are being used is not so easy. That's the Wild West.
Thank you, Bob. It sounds like not dead, perhaps a field in flux, responding to the changing ways that people interact with technology and are contactable. But just so it make sure we clear our animating question, who thinks polling is dead here on the stage?
We all have.
Well, you all have a vested interest.
Why
So
wouldn't we?
out there, is there anybody who thinks that polling is dead? I'm polling you now. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I definitely want to hear some questions from you all, but for the rest of these people, our job is done. Just wrap it up. Okay, so one thing I want to get into is whether this narrative that polling is dead is a crisis of methods or a crisis of communications. It seems to me that it's more of a crisis of communication. So in your work, Chris and Mike, who are the most important stakeholders out there who are saying something like polling is dead? Why do you think they think this, and how can they be kind of brought around?
Well, I think it's the chattering class mostly that says that polling is dead. Journalists, I think, play into that. Not data journalists, but just the horse race journalists, the political journalists, the ones who breathlessly cover every change in a sample size of 175 from poll to poll, and like, they got it wrong. And I think there is an expectation that polls should do more than they're capable of doing, and part of that is our inability to communicate the margin of error, and it gets complicated, right? In a story, you have 600 words, and you want to cover the horse race, and you want to cover the subgroups, and the idea of the multiple errors that can exist, and all sorts of things, doesn't get communicated, so expectations are really high. The bottom line, though, in 2022, polling performed better than it has since 1998 in terms of average error. So polling is not dead. And in fact, I mean, Mike and I are still hired by campaigns, none of whom think polling is dead, none of whom think, gosh, let's run our campaign without doing polls because polling is dead.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, if you work in a world where you're trying to win campaigns, you will always need to have intelligence on the people you're trying to appeal to. I mean, that's basic. The question is, how are you getting the intelligence to persuade them? So is polling dead? I mean, if you think polling died in 1932 and in 1948, and then it died in 2016 too. But like the phoenix, it rises with better approaches and different ways of understanding what we're using it for. As Chris said, most of what we do is almost none of my polls are public. I have one or two clients that we have public polling, but generally speaking, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out how to persuade people. And so the question is, how do we get the best data in order to persuade voters, to give the voters the choice that has them land at the decision we want, which is voting for our candidates?
So it sounds like neither of you are hurting for business, even though there is this narrative that might be out there. Chris, you wrote to me earlier this week that maybe the narrative that polling is dead relates to public polls or media polls, but not to the work that the two of you do on behalf of campaigns. This is something, as you said, the public doesn't see or hear, but obviously in a campaign context, the proof is in the pudding on election day. And so can you talk about how an example or a story of how you scrutinized your polling methods or accuracy or results kind of in a campaign context? How do you communicate that out to the campaign, and how do you keep their confidence high in the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm thinking of a particular race we were doing in 2022 for a super PAC. It was in support of a very high profile, well-known member of Congress. She was facing a primary challenge. And I went and did a survey in the state of Republican primary voters. And part of our survey, because it's internal, was message testing. So what that means is, first we ask the demographics, then we ask, the ballot, some other issue questions, and then we go into message testing generally against her opponent. So we did a whole battery of, if you knew that opponent did this, would you be less likely to vote for her, whatever. So we did the normal thing. We got 500 responses. I looked at the ballot, reported the results, and I said, you know what? Feelings are running very high. Tensions are very, very high here. If there's a battery of 6 questions against the opponent, I suspect that we're going to lose people who are in support of the opponent and aren't going to be included in the 500 who completed our survey. They would have gotten the ballot because the ballot came before the messages. So I went in and I reconfigured the ballot, adding back in the people who dropped off during the message section, and I had all the demographics. And in fact, they were significantly more Trumpy, significantly more likely to support the opponent. And if we hadn't, and so what I presented to the campaign was 2 ballots. 1, this is everyone who completed the survey. 2, this is the ballot that includes the people that we lost during that messaging section. I think this is the more accurate ballot. I think that we lost people who are going to vote and need to be, weighed into this. So that was, again, you can't really do that in a public story, a 600-word story. Although, I don't know if any of you read Nate Cohn's column March 1st. He went back in on their latest survey and actually added the 10 to 15% of people who didn't complete the survey. He even went into a big detail about it was kind of an unorthodox thing, but it's, he feels like, you're losing people who are important to the ballot. So he went in and did something like that. He acted like that was like a pretty unusual thing, but that's not, I don't know about you, Mike, but that's not terribly unusual. But in this case, this is what we did, and we could communicate to them, this is 500 ballot, but this is really, if you put those people that we lost, this is the ballot, and it changed, and this is what I think is more accurate. So those are the conversations you're having with your clients that the public isn't privy to.
Mm-hmm. Mike, do you have a similar?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I think it was Becca and maybe others talked about uncertainty and how it's hard to deal with uncertainty. Our clients want to know with certainty, but the reality is there's uncertainty. So we have to provide the best advice. We get hired to provide advice. We are pollsters, but we are hired to provide strategy and advice, not to just say who's going to win or lose this election. In fact, most of our campaigns don't poll 2 days before the election because they can't do anything with the data at that point. So the question is, in a world of uncertainty, what is our strategy and how do we win this? So the degree of uncertainty is significant. One of the biggest degrees of uncertainty is who's going to vote. We just don't know before the election who's going to vote on that election day, and it can vary. So my most recent example is we did the special election in New York's 3rd district, which is Long Island and Queens. When I just looked at the history of that district and the party registration, the Democratic Party registration advantage by election, it dramatically varied. Overall, all registered voters in that district were about a 10-point more Democratic than Republican. In 2016, 18, and 20, the electorate was 10 to 11 or 12 points more Democratic than Republican. In 2022, it was 4.5 points. In 2023, I don't even think Democrats had an advantage. And we're dealing with a special election in an odd year with nothing else on the ballot. Should I assume that this electorate is going to be a plus 12 Democratic electorate, a plus 1 Democratic electorate? Those assumptions radically change. So in that case, our top lines ran 3 different scenarios. We were looking at what does it look like if this is only a plus 4 Democratic electorate? We even got worse than that. I think we did a plus 11 and a kind of a middle of the road, which was plus 6 or 7. I think it ended up being about a plus 9 Democratic electorate. But that allowed us to see our most confident one had Swazi winning by the margin he won by. Our least confident had him winning by a very small margin. We were able to take that data and say, knowing this uncertainty, what are the strategic assumptions that we should live with and the choices that we need to make in defining the race and also driving turnout.
That's great. And that's the kind of back and forth that it's difficult to have sort of in a media spot like Christine, as you keep saying, in 600 words. That's not going to be the headline story. Bob?
Yeah, I just want to chime in related to the bias in the polls in terms of kind of mispredicting the actual electorate. Now, when you ask the question, is polling dead? For me, that's a two-dimensional question. There's the question, is election polling dead? And the election polling that was glaring was what happened in the recent elections in which the polls underrepresented Trump voters. Okay, and in particular, underrepresented Trump voters in the state. That was the bias. That was the bias, and the pollsters and statisticians weren't able to adjust for that. Haven't been able to adjust for that less. It explains why in the midterm election, when Trump wasn't on the ballot, there may have been less problems in the polls. That's election polling. But for me, when you ask, are polls dead? No, they're not dead. They're alive and well. You see reports all the time from Gallup poll, Pew Research Center, Kaiser Family Foundation, all the pollsters talking about political attitudes, social attitudes, other kinds of behavior. The question is, are those biases in the election polls affecting those results in terms of support for defense spending, attitudes toward gay marriage, attitudes toward abortion? Immediately after the election, with the polls mispredicting the states again, I wrote a piece for the Monkey Cage in which I argued, as pollsters, as the pundits were saying, polls are dead, unreliable. I chimed in and said, the election polls are bad, but polling on issues are not affected by those biases, and we have more of a fighting chance in adjusting because we have census data to represent the entire adult population. It turns out, and the Pew Research Center followed up on this, they actually did a study to see what kind of bias, if those kinds of voting biases occur, how did they affect attitudes toward issues? And the estimate they came up with was on the order of 1%, not much more than that. Well, mispredicting election by 1% is kind of a big deal. But if you don't quite get the exact percent, a good point estimate of the support for gay marriage, how big a deal is that if you're off by a point or two? An election, it's a different story. So those kinds of polls that try to study political attitudes, trends over time, correlations of factors that are related to attitudes, I think those kinds of things are alive and well. With one caveat, there are potential problems given the different polling methods used. The Pew Research Center came out with a report.
I was just going to ask you about that, Bob. Good. I'm glad you're getting there. About the finding about young people. And, go ahead, please.
Okay. There was a non-probability sample that reported a result that 30% of young adults thought the Holocaust was a myth. Pew compared that to the results from their probability sample panel, and they found that percentage was overestimated by a factor of about 3 or more. And so there are those kinds of biases that can creep in, especially when you have the Wild West of non-probability samples. You have voters professional poll takers out there, perhaps young voters who treat these things in a cavalier way and are misreporting what they think.
And I believe their working hypothesis there was the people in the opt-in internet sample were sort of rushing through the poll, clicking things randomly, and so it in particularly in the younger demographic, right?
Yeah.
And so what kinds of quality control issues then can be implemented? I mean, opt-in online panels are very widely used. They're also very cheap. And so what kind of quality control issues should we as consumers ask about when thinking about polls, or if we're ever in a position to hire a pollster, sort of what are the things that we should care about for pollsters who use those methods?
So this is a question I'm talking to my data scientist about all the time, right? Because we use opt-in polls or opt-in panels for some of our work. And so, there's a lot of different methods. So for example, those folks young people who are just trying to get their $5, they could be speeders. They probably are speeders. So what is looked at behind the scenes is the average amount of time it takes to do a survey. And if you are speeding through, our panel provider, we have a dashboard, they will eliminate the speeders. And I think our data scientist also does that. There are also other things, again, the panel provider that we have, or the dashboard, assigns what's called a pure score to people. And so the higher the pure score, the more likely they are to be legitimate, answer questions properly. The lower the pure score, I think they're sorted out. The other thing is, we sort of went back and forth on this. NORC had a pollsters confab last summer in DC, and we all talked about what do you do with maybe even 25% who are, international IP, bots, AI, or, rogue responders. And so people had different strategies. One of them is to put that question on, because in the study that Bob referenced, I think they found that something like X% of these young people said that they something about operated a nuclear submarine or something like that.
They were authorized to operate a nuclear submarine.
Right. So that's not true.
That can't be true.
That's not true. Or you have conflicting questions like, do you you're 18 to 34? Do you have private health insurance? Do you have Medicare? And so you try and do things like that. I don't know that anyone has hit on the perfect thing, but I think there's work being done on that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the critical question then are these low quality respondents different on the issues that we care about from other respondents? And do you have any sense of that? Or is there no relationship to the things that we ultimately want to measure? Or should we worry that we're not including these people in samples because of quality control issues?
So I would say the vast majority of voter polls that we do are voter file based and reaching people through a combination of texting and live dialers. So almost all of that. But when we do use panels, because there's we're trying to do ad testing, or we're trying to do something, trying to find some extremely low incidence audience that would be very difficult to do. That's exactly what we do. We include a few dummy questions and we clean the data, meaning we throw out responses for people that we're pretty sure weren't taking the survey seriously.
Kelly, I don't know if this was Pew wrote this or if this is something I remember from the NORC conference last summer, but actually there was an overlap between people who are sort of non-political, voters of color, younger, non-college, and those are the most difficult people to get into the polls. So how high of a quality control screen do you employ? I mean, it starts to get tricky. Yeah.
Yes, the art of polling. So, Bob, you were sort of drawing a distinction between election polling and issue polling. But of course, those two things are connected, both methodologically but also substantively, right? There are animating issues in every election year that seem to be the ones that drive not just vote choice, but also the composition of the electorate, who ends up coming out to vote and who stays home. Mike, you wrote me earlier this week that if you had been reading coverage of the polls prior to the 2022 midterms, maybe you would have gotten the impression that inflation would be the major issue for voters instead of abortion. But then after the election, you seem to take a different conclusion. So can you talk more about your thinking before and after the 2022 midterm about what issues were animating voters in that election, maybe how your expectations were upended, and then what lessons can we take into 2024 as we think about vote choice and the composition of the presidential electorate?
Yeah, so first we've started writing new questions beyond what's your top issue since 2022. In 2022, I should say, our advice to almost every Democratic campaign was to run on abortion, not because we thought inflation wasn't important, but because that was basically our only chance of winning those races. But what we learned, we've now done questions, the basic question of what's the most important issue in your vote choice. And when you ask that question, abortion is higher than it was pre-Dobbs, but it's still well below economic issues and immigration. We've created a new question. I call it the dispositive issue question. We don't use that term with the voters, obviously. But what we're basically saying is there an issue that you feel so strongly about that if a candidate had a different position from you on that issue, you wouldn't vote for that candidate? And when you ask that question, in the same survey you're asking what are your top issue questions, what you'll see is abortion and immigration is the other one. Those two rise above everything else. So sometimes there is an issue that it's not, voters aren't saying that's my top issue, because it's not like what they're saying they want politics to be focused on. They're not saying what I really would love is for Congress to focus on abortion. What they're saying is if somebody violates my values, my norms on that issue, that's dispositive. I am not voting for that candidate, or there's a high likelihood I won't vote for that candidate. So a lot of it is starting to ask questions in different ways and not just accepting. Things are more complex than any one question on a survey can tell us. And even on that issue, if you ask, then you have other layers. If you ask voters in New York versus Wisconsin, do they think that abortion is at risk in their state? In Wisconsin, they're going to say it at a much higher level in New York. Doesn't mean that issue won't work in New York, but you have a different bar and a different level of education that you have to do to use that issue. So we are, in some ways, the issue polling, it's not off in the sense of, are we getting the wrong percent who say they support marriage equality or whatever the issue may be? But our interpretation or analysis needs to get more sophisticated after what we saw in 2022.
Does anyone have anything to add there?
Well, the only thing I would add is that the pollsters need to be careful how they ask about the issue salience questions, whether they're giving voters a list or whether they're allowing them to basically offer multiple issues to get a better sense of the lay of the land.
Jordan, do you want to? So our co-panelist, Jordan, is going to come around and gather your questions. I want to make sure we leave time for that. And while she does, I'm going to ask a question that she submitted to the panel. There are many factors that contribute to declining response rates in surveys, of course. What are some ways we could expect polling to change in the face of this decline, or even if the decline continues? And perhaps you can speak to the difficulty that you mentioned, Christine, of contacting younger voters, for example.
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, I don't know how many of you are tracking just the wild swings that we're seeing among young voters between polls, right? I mean, you've got an 18 to 34-year-old sample and they're +4 Trump, and you've got an 18 to 34-year-old sample and they're +17 no Biden, and and then the question is, all kinds of things, but one of the questions is, are we not getting a representative sample of this, of young people or some of these audiences? And so one thing that polling firms have done is mixing up the modes. So as Doug said earlier, we contact people off a voter list. So that is our sampling, unit. But how we reach them, we give them options. So we text to cell phones, we call cell phones, and I've talked to classes, and I'll say, how many of you would text, like if you got an invitation to take a survey, how many of you would text it? And people are like, no way. And then, well, how many of you would answer your phone? Like, no way. But there are some who might, click click a text. I mean, and then there are some who might answer the phone if you just keep harassing them or what have you. Maybe, maybe you leave, one person said, and I thought this was a good idea, is, well, just leave me a message and just say, this is a survey, call me back and ask if this is legitimate. So, I mean, I think there's things that we can do, and it's not like we're not working on it. I think one thing I think people don't understand about the polling industry, now we're just sitting here going, yeah, things are really bad. What are we going to do about it? I mean, we're all trying, we're experimenting, we're investigating, the good ones are trying to be very transparent about it too, and like, we tried this helped, this didn't help. So, Mike, what are your smart thoughts?
Well, if one of you figures it out, please
Yeah.
call me. Don't call her, call me.
No.
A few years ago, when we were seeing our phone response rates really go down, we talked to our vendor that does the phone calling for us, and we said, what response rates are going down, what are we going to do? And they said, text. I think we're going to start merging in text. And lo and behold, that is what happened. Texting is now, and for those who do online fundraising, you saw the same thing. Email was raising a lot of money, then text was raising a lot of money, and now it's starting to wear out a little bit. We went to them recently and said, all right, you told us text, that started working, what's next? And they didn't really know. They jokingly said, maybe we'll go back to knocking on people's doors, which is not really what's going to happen. So it's a tough economic model, let's put it that way. So we don't know what's next. Something is going to come next. We know that, but I don't know that we know for sure what's coming next. One thing we did do, so we started using texting in 2020, and then we did more of it in 2022. After 2022, I think we were doing 25 or 30% of interviews via text. We went back and weighted, we just picked a random sample of surveys of ours from different types of states and locations, and we re-weighted everything, assuming that we had done 40% text instead of, I think, 25, and to see if it made a difference, and it didn't. So we're now up to 40% text because, and again, we have to keep looking at this to see if it impacts things. And a lot of our reasoning was actually the same as what Chris said. There's low response rates on both, but there are different types of people for whom, can we say peer pressure, not harassing?
Okay.
For whom the peer pressure of somebody calling them gets them to take the survey. And there's other people, the anonymity of being able to take it, on their phone or on their computer is something it's more appealing to them. So I think that has helped significantly.
One thing, Mike, I'm curious to know if you're finding this. So text to web is a big part of our methodology as well. But when we have sort of taken a look at our text to web versus our phone completes, I am seeing a higher don't know and a undecided or a don't know. And I feel like they're not feeling, like if you have somebody on the phone, they would get probed a little bit more, or they may feel more likely to answer. And I'm seeing a higher don't know. I mean, and then the question is that real? I mean, a lot of people aren't thinking about this. So is it real, or is it just like, let me get through this? But it's a mode difference that I've noticed, and just something to keep in mind.
Does the web part offer a don't know response?
These are design choices.
Yeah.
That impacts it a lot. If
Because
it's explicit on the text and it's only volunteer on the phone, you're going to get some of that. But these are like design choices we all face that are important.
But in terms of how to get high response rates, the General Social Survey and the American National Election Study still get high response rates because they doggedly go after every respondent. And at the end, their last effort involves a very large incentive payment.
How much?
I think on the order of 3 digits.
Hold out.
Hold out, that's the answer, yeah.
By the way, just so after the 2020 election, we joined with 4 other Democratic polling firms, and we did a large-scale survey in Wisconsin at cost. We didn't profit. We were just trying to do it and get paid whatever it cost, but no making any money off of it. And so what we basically tried to do is figure out if we try every method available and get a response rate, not census level, we're not going to spend, but we're not going to spend hundreds of millions, but I think we spent $1 million to try to do this. So we did everything. We did mail, we did text, we did phone, we did in-person door knocking, everything you can think of. And we got response rates quite a bit higher. It didn't make it more accurate, actually. And so We're just, obviously, if you're doing a census, then you don't have any problem. But even if we get to 50% response rates, which we're not going to get to in the time frame and the budgets that we have on campaigns, it's still not a guarantee that it's going to be representative. No matter how many times you try, there's a certain, and what we learned really was that there was a set of voters for whom the biggest variable was whether politics was part of their personal identity. And what we found is we were underrepresenting people for whom it's not part of their identity. It makes sense. They don't want to take a survey about politics if they don't care about politics. And in the 2020 election, that group of voters, we were having trouble getting the ones that were a little more Republican, that were voting Trump. It wasn't that we were having trouble getting the enthusiastic Trump supporters. It was the reluctant Trump supporters. And that, I think, was part of why there were polling mistakes in the Midwest in particular in 2020.
So I'm going to shift to some questions from our patient audience. How do you interpret the recent racial shifts in vote choice that we're seeing recently in polls? Do you believe them? Just to add something to that, there was a lively discussion on Twitter last week from somebody claiming we're in the middle of a racial realignment in terms of party identification. Personally, I don't know if I would go that far, but I wonder what your take is on maybe the declining performance among young voters of color for Democrats that we see in recent polls.
Well, just a little snippet here. I mean, Democrats are worried about young voters because of the Biden administration's position on Gaza. So that's been operating there. There are also issues of economic uncertainty. With regard to racial and ethnic voting among African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, Stan Greenberg and others have long argued that the Democrats are just doing a bad job appealing to the working class. And it's not just white working class, but it's also working class of these other groups as well. And I think those concerns seem to be driving that, at least in terms of response, in terms of incremental increases that Republicans and Trump's been getting, and also in recent poll reports. How that will play out when people actually vote is not unclear. Mm-hmm.
So a few things. One of the things that we try to do to the degree we can is try to look at who we're getting in different demographics. Because when you're doing a poll, sometimes your overall numbers are weighted properly, but underneath it there's pretty big differences. So when we get our data, we are sometimes sub-weighting. And so we have variables. We have partisan modeling scores. And so if I get the data back and my sample of African American voters doesn't really look like they're not as democratic by hard things I have in the voter file, then we'll wait to take that into account. And so some of it is that. But there is clearly something real happening with African American voters and younger voters, with Latino voters. Whether it is party realignment, whether Biden has work to do, I think that part's not clear. But I'll tell you the piece that for me is, this is sort of the challenge for Biden, but maybe the opportunity as well. One of the things that I've heard from young voters and black voters recently is disappointment that Biden wasn't able to get them the student loan relief that they were hoping for. Now, I assure you, in 2020, when the Democratic Party was debating whether we should go after, massive investments in student loan relief, the debate we were having was not whether young voters would be disappointed that we didn't do enough. The debate we were having was whether this would turn off older voters who started to question the spending or question whether it was fair that young voters were getting their loans relieved whereas they weren't. And this is really startling for us because the president produced a massive amount of student debt relief, more than anybody's ever done. And the reason he didn't get all the way there is because the Trump Supreme Court stymied him. That is an education and a messaging opportunity out there, I think, that we have, which is to let people know that maybe it wasn't enough, but whatever it was, $1.3 billion is more than any president has done prior in history, and he is trying to find other ways to get that money. So maybe some of you have been disappointed that it wasn't as fruitful as you had hoped, but that's a kind of an interesting, that's a performance rather than a fundamental shift in how they view politics.
Shifting gears a little bit, can you give us a few examples of, so one of our audience members is interested in the process of message testing. Can you guys give us an example of how that has worked in practice for you, or some sort of interesting findings that you have uncovered through a message testing process?
So I'll talk about 3 different techniques that we sometimes use. One is the basic technique people know about, which is I'm going to read you a series of messages and we ask them how persuasive they are, how convincing they are. Second is an A/B testing, as people might call it, a split sample. And so half get this version, half get this other version, and then we just look at the impact it has on some outcome we care about, a vote outcome. That's better. We can't do that for every single message in a survey, but that's our much better option. And then the third is we sometimes use a technique. There's a bunch of different techniques, conjoint analysis, or we often use something called max diff, where maximum differentiation, where essentially what you're doing is you're giving people a series. Let's say we're trying to find a message or an issue, and we'll give them 3 or 4 and say, pick your favorite and your least favorite, and they'll get a random set, and then we'll give them another random set. And ultimately, we're basically, through sampling, creating scores of every message, or if it's issue, every issue. And so that sort of forces differentiation. We have a sort of norm. Let's say the norm is 100. A really good message might get a score of 150. A bad one would be a 40 or 50. So those are 3 different ways that we do it.
Yeah, I mean, we really like max diff too. We had a client called Make My Move, and they try and incentivize people to locate to smaller towns or places. They have clients who are like cities or states, and they incentivize people to move there. So they wanted to figure out what attributes to emphasize to attract different people to this small town or whatever. And we had like 30, from like good Wi-Fi to parks and recreation to vibrant downtown scene. So there's like 30 of them. And we ran a max diff on that, and it was fabulous. It was very clear by cohort what the top attributes were for relocating to a particular city. So, yeah.
Jordan, are we ending at 2:30 or 2:45? Oh, good. I was afraid that our time had come to a close. But no, we have plenty of time. Okay. A member of our audience wants to know if how do pollsters take into account rapidly changing demographics of states? And so there are some states that just have a more dynamic population. Does that make polling there harder? And how do you think about those issues?
That's a good question. I think one thing, like if you're looking at your voter list and you're looking at past vote history, if you've got a highly, if you have a state that's attracting a lot of new residents, they may not have a vote history in that state. So you wouldn't want to exclude them from your sample. A lot of times you think to yourself, oh, I want to have a sample of people who voted in the last general election, or 2 of 4 or something like that. But usually what we do is we'll create a sample of people who have a voting history, but also anybody who's moved into the state since that last general election. And they won't necessarily have a voting history, but you can't leave them off, because, they're very likely registering to vote. So. Yeah.
And what are some states that have these attributes? Like, where are people moving?
There's lots of them. So I think there's growth in states, but growth in demographic groups. So the Asian Americans is the fastest growing demographic group. So what you'll try to look at is the trend line. So in 2016, Asian Americans in this state were 1%. In 2020, they were 2%. I think they're going to be 3%. I mean, I'm simplifying, but those are the types of things we're looking at. But there's lots of movements. I mean, I was actually looking at a Hispanic population, look state by state, and obviously there's the big states in the Southwest that we know, big states in terms of their share of the electorate Hispanic. But Indiana has like 4%. There's movement going on in some of these places. There's growth in certain parts of Wisconsin. So a lot of different places where there's growth of certain groups that we're paying close attention to.
Okay. Now I have a survey construction methodological question for you. Do you believe the neutral response on a Likert scale has value? Or is it an escape for respondents to give instead of their true answer? Bob?
It depends. Well, my answer to that would be it depends.
It depends?
I think that's right.
Oh, no, okay.
And it probably depends on the salience of the issue. If you're asking me, would I use a neutral point? I would.
Go.
I think it also depends, but I mean, so like if you're asking about some sort of complex, like pharmacy benefit managers, how many of you know what a pharmacy benefit manager is? Right. So we had to do survey work on pharmacy benefit managers and like what they do and stuff. So like, I don't think you want to force people to have an opinion about pharmacy benefit managers if they don't have an opinion about that. So in that case, I think a neutral is an appropriate thing to have. Because again, then the client knows this is an education thing, which you could have told them without the survey. But in other cases where you really need to target based on attitudes, say maybe on abortion issue or something that you think that they probably have an opinion on, maybe you don't, but yeah.
Yeah, I tend to use neutral on, or some version of that on like a favorability type scale, but not on a how persuasive is a message. I'll allow somebody to say they don't know, but I try not to have a neutral on that.
I mean, just to give an example of the complexity of this,
Okay.
and what we know. The American National Election Study asks a bunch of various questions on what boil down to be 7-point scales where there's a midpoint. But those questions often have a preface. They ask people's opinions, or haven't you thought about this enough? So they've restricted people, so people who haven't thought about it have an out. And then the idea is that neutral position would have more meaning because of that.
Somewhat relatedly, a member of the audience asks, how do you think about issue polling when a topic has or has not been politicized or made salient? So I'll add something to that, which is I work for an organization that broadly deals with election administration issues, and there are novel issues coming up in election administration all the time. And we do a lot of polling, and we want to know what people think, but we're often struggling to word questions in a way that allows people to give high-quality answers about things maybe they haven't considered before reading the question that we ask. How do you think about that art of question construction on an emerging issue in politics?
Okay. Well, it sounds to me that that's a good idea. This question of asking about issues that aren't salient is a long-standing issue in the study of public opinion and political psychology, going back to Philip Converse, The Nature of Belief Systems in Mass Publics, where there were debates about whether people have attitudes at all. And the answer is it depends. It depends on how salient the issue is. If you're asking questions like that, you ought to think good and hard about doing that, because if you know it's not a salient issue, you know you're likely to get attitudes that are not crystallized and perhaps not yet formed. And so that falls under the rubric of measurement error, and you need to give serious thought whether you even want to ask a question like that.
So for me, it depends on what my goal is on the survey. So if my goal is just to understand what does the public think about this issue, then I have concerns about asking about something that they're unlikely to know about, or at least I have to give them the opportunity to say they don't know. If my goal is to make that issue salient, or let's take election administration. In Wisconsin, there's going to be ballot initiatives this year that have to do with how elections are run and funded and so forth. You know, somebody's going to try to figure out how to win, or I guess we had it already, right? Or did it just happen, or it's about to happen? I can't remember. Anyway, I wasn't working on that one. So in that case, you're probably going to start with answers on the ballot initiative that have a lot of people in the mushy middle or undecided, and you're trying to figure out how to define it. And so for those, of course we want to be asking about it, and asking about it in a way that we can see where do people start and where do they finish after we present information on it.
So here's a provocative question for you. As polling and pollsters gain more power, because they're the brokers of data, and political parties rely heavily on their insights, is there a threat to democracy when the brokers are increasingly in charge?
Wow, that's a conspiracy theory. I do not feel like I have that much power. Do you? I don't know. I don't feel like I'm very powerful.
Well, I mean, the conservative marketplace view of this is that pollsters are business people, And they should have, because of that, they should have incentive to do high quality work so they'll get rehired again and keep up their business. And so we're banking, no pun intended, heavily on that.
Read it again? I had never thought of this.
So I think the claim broadly is that campaigns rely very heavily on the work that you do, and that gives you a lot of power. Is there something anti-democratic about that? About the role that pollsters play in campaigns and in outcomes?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you think of what we're doing. In a lot of ways, what we are doing is we're basically asking the questions and letting the voters tell us what they think. So in that sense, it's pretty democratic. On the other hand, we're also trying to figure out how to win. So we are trying to shape public opinion. You know, I think in reality, on our side, I don't know, I can speak to myself personally. I am personally a very liberal person. But I am constitutionally very pragmatic. So I may be more liberal than a lot of my candidates, and I'm not trying to push them to be more liberal than they are. And some of them I may be not as liberal. We're just trying to figure out the strategy to help people we generally believe in win. So do we have too much power? I don't know. Maybe.
I think that they should ask media consultants that question.
Should ask who?
Media consultants.
Media consultants.
Yeah, they need to be asked that question, not us.
We're just up here trying to let the data
We're
speak.
just we're just talking to people.
So I believe Greg has a follow-up about, Mike, something that you talked about, the kinds of questions that you ask now post-2022, the dispositive questions. He says it's very fascinating and would like to know if the reliability of those questions varies with education or with knowledge of politics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, yes, and how we construct those questions matters too. So for example, like, actually, is inflation a dispositive issue? Well, what does that mean to have a position on inflation that somebody's position is I feel so strongly that I'm not going to vote for them? Like, who's pro-inflation, right? I mean, maybe in certain circumstances some economists are, but generally speaking, so a lot of it's how you construct the question, and I do think that there are, and by the way, the answers are going to change in a moment's time when an issue has risen on people's lists. There are definitely differences by education and a lot of other things, but there's a lot of people who can answer that question in some way. And my argument is we have to pay attention to that question as well as the other questions. What's your most important issue is another question to pay attention to. We just need to be asking different and more questions to have a better understanding of it, and keep changing these questions as new things come along and looking at the differences. So if you have on that question Gaza and Israel, pay close attention to who is picking that as their dispositive issue. And so those are the ways that we're looking at it, because it can be, those things can change very quickly based on current events, but they also can change on politics. I remember several years ago, many years ago, when there was a proposal by President Bush, the second President Bush, on Social Security, individual accounts, and so forth. And for a very brief period of time, Social Security rose like 8 points on people's top priorities, not because they cared about Social Security more, but they were hearing about it more.
So Kelly, I just went through this with a client. So we were analyzing a statewide survey. It was a public survey, so it wasn't one that I had done. And the top issue concerns were the economy, then crime, immigration, blah, 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 education. Very bottom was abortion at 5%. And I created a slide for them, and I said, how not to interpret this result. So one way to interpret the result was, we don't have to worry about the issue of abortion because it's dead last on the issues that matter to voters, or the top issues. And I said that is completely wrong. This is an absolute deal breaker issue for huge amounts of voters. It's a blue state. And we know this because we are political. We are paid for our analysis. We follow the results of other elections. We talk to these voters in a qualitative way. That's one thing we haven't talked about here at all. Mm-hmm. We do a ton of qualitative work, ongoing qualitative panels, one-time qualitative, focus groups or whatever. And, Mike calls it dispositive. I call it deal breakers. So when talk to these voters, you realize, oh, yeah, you're not going to say this is your most important issue, but if you're talking to them and you realize that this person has a perceived extreme position or one that doesn't link with you, that's a deal breaker. And so you have to pay attention to, you guys are data analysts, many of you here in this program, and you get all sorts of inputs, right? But qualitative is another important input, and you need to marry it all up, and you have to be smart. And the reason this isn't just a data analytics program, it's a political analytics program, is because you also have to be political. You have to understand politics. And so, the data could say one thing, and if you were literally looking at abortion at 5%, you would be like, oh, but you have your whole political hat. You have, your experience that tells you.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Data isn't just data, right? And I think that shows the value of a program like political analytics. And so I want to wrap up our panel by addressing the students in the room in the political analytics program or anyone else in the room who might be considering a career in polling. What are some questions they should ask themselves or factors they should consider to decide whether or not that's a good career path for them?
I'll tell you a story that maybe helps answer it.
Great.
Many years ago, I had a colleague who worked in the NGO world and decided to come into polling, and very smart guy. And after 2 years, he just said he was leaving. And when we asked him why, he said, well, when you guys get those crosstabs, it used to be a book. We called it a book. Now it's on the computer. But when you get 300 pages of crosstabs and you analyze the data, you see music. I just see numbers. So I would say if you see music, do polling.
Wonderful.
I would say, this is interesting. I mean, not everybody who is a pollster has the same skill set. I think if you are not only an analytical person, but if you're an intuitive person, I feel like the two of those go really well together in polling. Analytical, but also intuitive. And again, that might not exist in the same person, but hopefully it exists in the same firm that that you can coordinate there. And also, if you like to work on a variety of topics, if you don't want to do the same boring thing all day long, every day, polling is for you. That's the thing I think I love most about polling is even though, some of the topics are pharmacy benefit managers, sometimes they're not, right? Like sometimes they're like, I don't know, all sorts of interesting things. And so that is what is really cool about polling, because every time you work with a different client focused on something different, you're learning and you're understanding more about people and life.
Yeah, what I would add is something a little bit more on the kind of practical and education side. One is look in the field and what the field looks like, and look and consider what the career pattern is of people in the field in terms of rising from entry-level positions to higher-level positions, and see if that is something that you would be happy with. Secondly, to that end, see what you need to determine what kind of education, formal education you need to reach the whatever level that you're aspiring to, whether it involves just additional analytic training, while it involves certification at the master's degree level, or whether it might involve a PhD, which would put you at sort of a higher level and a position to apply for things like, directly for things like government and other grants where the principal investigator has to have a high-level degree.
Great. I'm hiring too, by the way. Anyone's interested. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bob, for a great panel. And we can safely conclude that polling is alive and well, for better or worse. We'll see you in 2024.
Yay.